seminar organized by Center for Sino-Russian Studies. It's part of the Romanian Institute of Political Science and International Relations. And we are honored to have here with us two very distinguished guests and experts from one of the most prestigious American institutions, Heritage Foundation, very well included for the quality of its experts. So again, it's a real pleasure to try to understand the help of our guests, the way in which US is looking at Russia and China. How are Russia and China viewed from Washington? This is the title of our seminar. Let me start presenting our guests. You have the bios, you have the CV, so I'm not going to get into too much details. It's about Mr. James J. Carafano, very well known here in Romania. He's a Vice President at Catherine and Shelby Cowan Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy, and the E.W. Richardson Fellow. Thank you for being with us. And Mr. Anthony Key, it's a research manager and editor of the Index of Economic Freedom, Center for International Trade and Economics. Thank you for being with us. So I'm the moderator, so I'm not going to talk about Russia and China. We have the experts here. So, but I'm going to say a few words about Romania in this context. And as far as Russia is concerned, according to our surveys, according to our barometer of security, I would say that Romania is Russia-proof. So if you look at it, I don't know, try to understand the public opinion or I don't know, the political positions of Romanian elite, it's very clear. Since 1991, I would say, the position was basically the same. Somebody could argue that maybe it's a little bit too harsh approach and to have frozen relationship with Russia would be a very good idea, but that's just a different story. China, it's different. In China, it's a new challenge, not only for Romania. I think particularly for Romania because the perception of Romanians is China is not a China, it's a Soviet Union or Russian Federation. Even before 1989 was basically a split, the difference between China and Soviet Union. And I remember there's an old joke that goes like this. It's always before 1989. Say that, that's Romanian fisherman caught a golden fish and was asked for the first wish. First wish, men had to be invaded by China. Okay, your wish. Where is being invaded by China? At that time, China had a huge amount of population, very hungry, and second wish, be invaded by China. And your last wish, be invaded by China again. So anyways, be invaded by China 3 times. And the golden fish was puzzled. I said, okay, why 3 times invaded by China? He said, yes, said the Romanian fisherman, because they passed to Soviet Union 6 times. So that was a joke during the communist times. So it said something about perceptions. And in 1968, with the invasion of Czechoslovakia, that Romania got 2 very important messages. One from US was a message sent by Secretary of State, Rusk was the Secretary of State at the time, and sent a message to Ambassador Dobrynin. Dobrynin was the Soviet ambassador to US, and said, don't push too much, don't let Romania. And it was President Johnson it said that the Soviet move against Romania would unleash the dogs of war. It was a very important message for Bucharest, because at that time in 1968, tension was very high. And a similar message from China, from Beijing. Chu Enlai was the prime minister at the time. So yeah, the perception is different, but now we realize that China is different. China is not what it used to be. Deng, famous phrase, hide your strength and bide your time, is not available anymore apparently. The wolf external diplomacy and all this stuff, it shows a different face of China. I'm not sure that China is able to deal with this new status anymore. I'm not sure that they're very comfortable with being on the stage. But anyway, it's interesting that if you look at it, some American analysts, they say that that China is dangerous because it's a rising power, Putin did the trap. And now recently, in foreign affairs and foreign policy, Russia is dangerous because of the declining power, right? So anyway, it's dangerous. So we have to deal with it in one way or another. It's a declining or rising power. So I'm not going to go into survey, but we can talk about this way in which public opinion is shaping on China. It's interesting because we have some very relevant data in our barometer of security. But we go back to these issues later. So, having said that, let me invite our very special guest. We'll start with Mr. James Jay Carafano to help us to understand a little bit more what is going on with China and Russia, and how Romania could at least understand a little bit better what is happening around us. Thank you, sir.
Well, yeah, thank you, and thank the Romanian Academy so much for actually just being with you in your office and hearing your views, explaining the geopolitics of the region. It was just really so helpful, and so this has been a great opportunity for us, and we really great appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak with you, and thank you also to Alex and the Euro-Atlantic and Council of Romania for this as well. So I thought, since the Academy doesn't actually focus a lot on military issues, that maybe I would focus a little bit on military issues and talk a bit about China. And so I think there were three kind of fundamental elements to understanding the Chinese military and its impact on geopolitics. And I thought I'd go through those very quickly. The first one is how do the Chinese win with their military? And I think this is really important. It's like, what is their fundamental strategy? And I think of all the things that we know about China and their attempts to be opaque and non-transparent, that this is one we actually really understand well, because if you actually read the Chinese writings on this, it's really quite explicit. China's goal is to win without fighting, which actually is very similar to the Russian strategy. So in part, obviously, it's the great appeal of classical Chinese strategy and Sun Tzu or Sun Tzu. But of course, the geopolitics are very different from when Sun Tzu was writing in the Warring States period. That was a strategy for weakness, right? All the states were weak, so don't get too involved in fighting your enemy, because if you do, somebody else will come over and conquer you. And obviously, China is not a weak state, but this strategy has great appeal to them. And I think there's some obvious reasons for that. One is, obviously the last thing they want is an actual direct violent confrontation with the United States, because billions of people would die, including a lot of Chinese. So the idea of solving your problem through a large-scale conventional war is obviously incredibly unappealing for the Chinese. I mean, they're no less logical than we are. But I think there's also a belief in the Chinese leadership that their strategy can produce incremental gains that over time will allow them to accomplish that, either through intimidating or defeating ourselves through self-interest or through division, or through making marginal gains over time. They can accomplish their goals, not using the military explicitly, but in terms of an element of pressure. And I think Taiwan is a very good example of that. I'm not sure how much press there has been here, but of course in the United States there's a tremendous amount of press recently on Taiwan and the overflights, and there's all these articles, are we headed for war? And I think the analysts think that's not really what's going on here. This is part of a pressure campaign on the part of the Chinese government to, intimidate Taiwan, maybe impact their internal dynamics, to set up the right atmosphere for the upcoming party congress, to send a message to the Americans. But this doesn't seem like the next step to war in the way we go from, annexing Czechoslovakia and taking the Sudetenland. Which I think gets to the key lesson, which is what's really important in responding to Chinese military pressure and their developments is to not overreact and not underreact. Right? Not overreact in a sense, prompt a confrontation that's unnecessary, but on the other hand, don't underreact either, and in a sense encourage the Chinese to commit to more aggression. I mean, actually what we've seen is where in Taiwan, for example, where the United States has been most forward-leaning in supporting Taiwan in its self-defense, the Chinese response has normally been to be nicer to the Taiwanese and to back off. That's where I'm really impressed with the Academy and their work to really create a center on China and focusing on understanding Chinese behavior, because I think that is really the key to good geopolitics today. So the second one goes on the nature of Chinese military power. And it's not to think of Chinese military power as an independent instrument. The Chinese really fundamentally believe in the concept of civil-military fusion. That all the elements of national power really belong to the Chinese Communist Party. Doesn't matter if you're the private sector, you're a company, or you're the military or university. Potentially they all are responsible to answer to the Chinese Communist Party, and they are potentially an instrument of the Chinese Communist Party to express its will. And so even more than in the US, where we say we have a National Security Council and we bring in the Defense Department and the State Department, in China they truly believe that all those instruments are fused and that they all serve a common purpose. And I think the recent hypersonic missile test that the Chinese conducted, which you probably have heard about, I think that's a perfect example of that. The Chinese used this test much in the way that the Soviets did Sputnik back in the day. Sputnik was not a technological game changer. The Soviets really weren't any further ahead in satellites than US were. But the Soviets played that really for propaganda value and then demonstrate that we are rising, we are powerful, we are outpacing the Americans. Matter of fact, famously the Soviets, when they launched Sputnik, said, well, this is just an innocent satellite launch, there's no military implications here or whatever, we're just nice people. All the time knowing that the message that they were sending the Americans is, look, if we can put a satellite in space, we can put a missile in space, we are going to catch up and surpass you in the strategic arms race. I think that's exactly what the Chinese have done here. Look, I mean, this is not a game changer. The United States is going to develop hypersonic weapons. The Russians are going to develop hypersonic weapons. The Chinese are, they're a new element of strategic competition, but they're not anything dramatically different. Well, what's the lesson to be taken away from that? And it's more, I think, a lesson for the United States than really for Romania. In the Cold War, not that the competition with China and Russia today is analogous to the Cold War, but is the extent is what was the safety net? What was the thing that really kept geopolitical competition from spinning out of control, whether it was economic or political or military? And it really was strategic deterrence. I mean, strategic deterrence just limited the behaviors of powers. And I think that's completely applicable to here. The safety net for modern peace and stability in the world today really is American strategic and conventional deterrence. And the capacity for that deterrence to be effective against both the Russians and the Chinese. And so a strong, resilient American strategic and conventional deterrent on a global level is, I think, just essential for peace and prosperity in the modern world today. My third point is, I know I said that China wants to move without fighting, and the military is in part an instrument to reinforce the other elements of Chinese power, but that doesn't mean that there's not going to be any fighting. The Chinese they'll fight people. I mean, they had fist fights with the Indians on the border, and occasionally they sink a fishing vessel and stuff. They're not averse to using military force, and I actually think increasingly over time they will. And I think where we will actually see this is really on the periphery, where we will see a point when China, I think, becomes so self-confident that they won't be averse to using military power to impose their will in the distant parts of the Chinese empire, much in the way they were not averse to using the military to impress their internal Uyghur population. So they have a Belt and Road, which is really designed to extend Chinese political and economic and security influence. If you actually look at the structure of the Chinese military, they're developing what we would call expeditionary capabilities, the means to actually do stuff at a distant place. And at some point, we'll see them do that. There'll be a country that will, foreclose on its debts, and the Chinese will send in some troops, or they'll send them in to protect Chinese interests. So there will be fighting, much in the way that when the United States and the Soviet Union checkmated itself during the Cold War, it didn't mean that we stopped fighting wars. We had the Korean War, we had the Vietnam War. There was conflict at the sub-strategic level. Potentially that could happen with China as well. So what's the lesson there? Well, I think there's a lesson for European security. I think the notion of European autonomy is really nonsensical. Look, Europe only really has two really core hard power threats that could actually threaten the peace and stability of Europe. One is the Russians, and the other is the spillover of problems from the Middle East. The reality is the military capacity of Europe combined isn't equal to deal with either of those problems. So real European security is only in the context of transatlantic security. Matter of fact, I had this discussion with an ambassador, diplomat from a country in Europe, which will go nameless, and we were talking about European autonomy, and when I made this statement, he goes, "Oh, of course I agree with that." He goes, "But that's not what European autonomy is really about." And I go, "Well, what is it about?" So he gave me a scenario where we would go into this country in Africa, in a state, and I said, "Well, that's really interesting." I go, "But to do that, you would have to have American logistics, and American long-range refueling, and American intelligence support." He goes, "Oh, I know that." And so I was like, "Well, that doesn't sound very autonomous to me." But in terms of dealing with China, I think it's not, from a European perspective, the security concern is not like it is with Russia. What Europe needs to be able to assure itself of is that it can mitigate Chinese influence in Europe's capacity to exercise collective security and collective defense. That might be Chinese influence that breaks down European political solidarity and keeps Europe from acting in its own interest. It might be compromising infrastructure that prohibits NATO or the EU from conducting self-defense measures. But it does definitely mean about taking issues about infrastructure and political solidarity and Chinese influence in those areas and being very serious and realistic about them in a way that Europe hasn't been in the last decade and must become. That doesn't mean to say that there's not a role for European countries in dealing with Chinese malicious activity around the world, because I definitely think there is. I mean, I think, for example, the US, UK, Australian submarine deal. That's an example. And by the way, I think nothing against France, but the French submarine deal, that was going to fail anyway. They weren't hitting their cost or delivery milestones. I don't think you really blame the US and the UK for that. And really, Australia's strategic needs had shifted. I mean, really what they need they need a nuclear submarine force that gets China's influence. They have to have nuclear submarines, and the French were never going to deliver on that. But I think there is actually an important role for France in the Indo-Pacific. They're probably the country with some of the greatest influence and greatest capability in the region. There are places for countries like Romania in terms of bilateral cooperation with Japan and other Asian powers on not necessarily on military issues, but on a range of issues. So there are individual things you can do, but fundamentally, nations mean to maintain their independent capacity to act in their own self-interest, and I think that's the big issue of concern. So you probably, everybody, heard that, I guess, I don't know if it's an Indian or a Chinese proverb or whatever, but when the elephants fight, it's the grass that gets trampled. Is that a big thing in Europe? It's a big thing in Asia. Right? And of course, it's used to say, well, the United States and China, when you guys tug with each other, it's us that live with all the consequences. And the implication is well, what we need to do is stay neutral and stay out of the fight and let the elephants tug against each other. But the reality is you can't fundamentally be neutral in a competition between the United States and China, because China doesn't recognize neutrality. To China, to Beijing, if you're neutral, it just means that you're a likely candidate to be seduced or influenced or overwhelmed. So it's like, when the elephants fight, the grass gets trampled. The alternative is that China comes in and mows all the grass. So
the same when the elephants make love.
Yeah. So I do think that at a national level, because that ultimately contributes to a European consensus, transatlantic consensus, countries need to, in a sense, insulate themselves from the malicious Chinese influence, which will not undermine their independence. And I think that does impact on the security field. And actually, I would say Romania has actually, I think, been a model of that kind of independent policy. So thank you for the opportunity. And I'll just end with this, which is these three realities that I just talked about. I'm not sure what I would call it, like the European elites and even the elites in my own country really recognize this. That there is, I think, in both the present administration and many in Brussels and Berlin and France today, the notion is what we really need to do in China is compete where we must, but cooperate where we can. I think this is a very unrealistic strategy. Yeah, we can find lots of areas to compete. I mean, if you just look at the nature of China's military power, for example, it guarantees that. The problem is where are we going to cooperate? There really aren't issues where there's fruitful space for cooperation. Climate change is often mentioned, but China's the world's biggest polluter, and if anything, China's behavior is actually tending to be less cooperative. They're actual, as opposed to the rhetoric, less cooperative on dealing with issues of climate change and the environment. So this model will inevitably fail, and it doesn't really recognize the true nature of Chinese power in the world today, which calls for mitigating the threats as opposed to the notion that somehow we're going to norm our way to some area, some way of stability and stasis.